Hi there, it's time for another Commodore 64 compilation review, and this one's the first compilation to ever be released by one of the big hitters in the world of Commodore 64 compilations, US Gold. The compilation's called Arcade Hall of Fame. It was released in 1985 and it cost $9.95 for the cassette version. And let's take a look at it now and see if it's going to make it into my compilation Hall of Fame. Let's take a look at the packaging for this one in more detail, and I have to say this one's quite interesting because it's called Arcade Hall of Fame, but you can see the list of games that are included on it: Spy Hunter, Tapper, Up and Down, Blue Max and Aztec Challenge. Well, you'd think this was a collection of arcade conversions, but only 3 of those, the first 3, are actually arcade conversions. So then we look at the packaging in terms of the image on the front of it, and we've got some images that loosely represent some of the games. So we've got the waiter with the cocktail shaker, that's kind of representing Tapper, although he served beers or root beers and things like that, not cocktails. Then we've got a car with machine guns firing out of it. That's clearly supposed to represent Spy Hunter, although the car in Spy Hunter was white, not red. You could perhaps think it's representing the car in Up and Down, but that's a beach buggy, so no. And then we've got a biplane, which is representing Blue Max. That's fairly straightforward. But then we've got nothing representing Aztec Challenge or Up and Down, really, because we've also got 2 modern jet fighters on there, one of which I have to say looks like Starscream from the Transformers. So I don't know what they were thinking with this cover, but it's very clearly not representative of the games that are on the compilation. So then we look at the spine and it just says Arcade Hall of Fame and the Commodore 64 system and US Gold on it, but it's the wrong way around compared to what most spines are, so that's a bit annoying as well. And then when we look on the back, there's no more information about the games. There's just a list of the games that are included again, and it's got one of these old black clamshell style cases, so there's no space for any screenshots or descriptions of any of the games like that. So first impressions are not particularly good. Here we have the 2 cassettes that make up the compilation. As you can see, it's got the US Gold on the cassette label there, and it says Arcade Hall of Fame, and then a list of the 2 games that are on it. So it's got Spy Hunter on one side, Tapper on the other, and then the second tape has got Up and Down on one side, and then Blue Max and Aztec Challenge on the other side. So then we move to the inside of the main inlay, and it's not got any details about what the games are. Again, it's just got this stuff about both cassettes recorded on each side. Tape 1 has Spy Hunter on one side and Tapper on side 2. Well, I think you could work that out by looking at the cassette. It then says basically how to load the tapes, and it also mentions that there's 2 games on the side of one tape, and goes into a lot of detail about how to get your tape counter reading to make sure you know where to load the second game off that tape. I guess it was quite new at this point that you'd have more than one game on one side of a cassette, so I guess that's fair enough, but that's a lot of information that you could probably just work out for yourself. It continues with some loading instructions, and that's about it, other than some addresses and things like that. It's got the information in French as well. That's it for the actual inlay, and then we move on to the instructions, of course. Here we have the instructions fully spread out, and as you can see they take up lots of space. It's got the French language instructions on the opposite side of these, so it starts off with some obvious stuff like loading instructions, again, because that was already on the inlay, and then it goes into a lot of detail about each game, and I mean a lot of detail, because look how much detail there is for the Spy Hunter instructions there. It's got everything. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about what's in the instructions. You can probably get an idea about what's in there without me going into too much detail, but I do want to point out a couple of interesting things that amuse me. The first thing is on the Up and Down instructions, it frequently refers to your vehicle as a Baja Bugger. So it says it like loads of times in capital letters. You're racing your Baja Bugger over dangerous and treacherous roads. To stay alive, jump your Baja Bugger and land on the top of your opponent. So I thought that was interesting. It does go on to say it many more times as you go through the instructions, always in capital letters, as you can see there. And another thing I noticed is for the Blue Max instructions, it's got the Atari instructions to some extent as well. I can't actually see where they are now, but somewhere in there it tells you about the Atari instructions, which is weird because this wasn't even released for the Atari. We get over to Aztec Challenge and someone's put the tape counter number in there for future reference. I think it mentions the Atari on the Aztec Challenge instructions somewhere as well. So yeah, basically what they've done is copy and pasted the instructions from the original releases of the games without really simplifying it for the sake of this compilation. So you could say it's comprehensive, but you could also say it's a little bit overkill. While I was searching for information about this compilation, I discovered there's a slightly different version of it released in Germany. You can see the cover of that version here. In this version, Spy Hunter and Blue Max are omitted in favour of Stellar 7 and Drop Zone. Now at that time they had some pretty strict censorship rules in Germany, and they were particularly sensitive about anything that referenced war. So that explains why Blue Max was omitted, because although it doesn't explicitly say so, you can interpret the game as being a simulation of an assault on Germany by Allied forces. I can't really think what they got upset about Spy Hunter for, but nevertheless it's omitted. The knock-on effect of removing those two games from the compilation, though, renders this cover even more irrelevant, as you've now got a machine gun firing car and a biplane on the cover that have no relevance to any of the games in the compilation. Let's move on and take a look at the advert for the compilation, and this would have featured in various magazines of the time. This particular one was taken from issue 9 of Computer Gamer magazine, but it also featured in magazines such as Computer and Video Games, and I think Zap as well. So you can see it heavily reuses the assets from the front cover of the compilation, with the Arcade Hall of Fame logo and that mishmash of different images that are supposed to represent the games, even though half of them don't actually represent the games on it. At the bottom you can see the price is confirmed at $9.95 for a cassette version, and it also appears that the compilation was released on disc at a price of $14.95. It's billed as a chart-busting compilation for Commodore that explodes with action, and then in the centre of the page you've got a rundown of each of the 5 games that are included, bigging up their chart performance and also any superlatives levelled towards them by magazine reviews. So there's not a great deal of information about exactly which charts they appeared on, but it says that Spy Hunter spent 16 weeks on the charts and Zap called it a superb arcade game. Tapper spent 9 weeks on the charts and Your Computer said it had great sound and graphics and was fast and addictive. Up and Down spent 7 weeks on the charts and was described as a curious, cute and highly addictive car game by Computer Trade Weekly. Aztec Challenge spent 16 weeks on the charts, and its gripping music and imaginative setting make this 7-screen thriller a cut above the rest according to Zap. And finally, Blue Max spent 10 weeks on the charts and is a great game that's highly enjoyable according to Your Commodore. It has to be said though that no matter how much they big up the games on the compilation, this advert's got an awful lot of grey on it, and that doesn't really make it stand out as a particularly exciting proposition. And the final thing I want to look at before taking a look at the games is this article from the front page of Home Computing Weekly from September 1985, which features a preview of several compilations that were about to be released. It primarily focuses on Ocean's They Sold a Million, but it does also mention Arcade Hall of Fame. It doesn't really tell us anything we don't already know, just confirming the list of games that are going to be included and confirming that it was scheduled for release before Christmas 1985. What this article does do though is pose an interesting question, because this was the early days of compilations coming out, and it asks the question, is the market about to be saturated with bargain compilations, making gamers simply wait for the Star Game compilations instead of buying the originals? And it's got some quotes from Nick Alexander, who masterminded Now Games. He felt that compilations represented extra business rather than taking it away from other parts of the market, saying compilations have been around for a long time, but what's new is the licensing agreements that mean that games from different companies can be included. He went on to say compilations hadn't hit the record market, and in the same way he didn't think they'd adversely affect the software market. So I thought that was an interesting question. How did the rise in gaming compilations affect your purchasing habits? Let me know in the video comments. For me, as a late adopter of the Commodore 64, getting mine in 1988, compilations were the perfect way for me to bolster my collection with some of the best games that have been released up to that point. I always liked to get value for money even back then, so I definitely feel that I picked up more compilations than new releases, along with the budget re-releases from the likes of the Hit Squad and Kicks. So that does it for the preamble on Arcade Hall of Fame. Let's move on to looking at the 5 games included in the compilation. And this is another one where I'd never played any of these games before on the Commodore 64, although I had played Spy Hunter and Tapper in the arcades and also the BBC Micro home conversions. Let's kick things off then with the first of 3 arcade conversions on this compilation. Spy Hunter, released on the Commodore 64 in 1985 and based on the 1983 Bally Midway arcade game. You play the role of a world-class spy driving for your life in your ultra-equipped turbocharged spymobile. The road is crawling with enemy agents bent on your destructions, and they'll stop at nothing, so neither can you. Manoeuvre your car with all the speed and skill you can, always watching for the Road Lord, the Switchblade, the Enforcer and other enemy agents as they try to stop you cold on land and water. The game starts as the weapons van rolls up from the bottom of the screen and pulls over to the shoulder of the road. Your car rolls out the back armed with machine guns. You then manoeuvre your car onto the road and the action begins. The road will branch and fork as you go, so you must be careful as you dodge and chase enemy agents not to swerve off the road. The terrain will change as you traverse the course. Screen backgrounds will change colour as an indication of the new terrain, and as the course continues you'll come to a waterway. Here your car automatically becomes amphibious and skims across the surface of the river, which is teeming with enemy agents. There are also bridges to navigate, some of which are damaged, and stretches of icy road where the surface is slippery and your car is harder to control. Each time you enter a new terrain, the weapons van appears on the side of the road ready to supply you with the appropriate new weapon. To gain access to new weapons, you must allow the van to pass you, then get behind it and drive into it. The van will automatically let the car roll out once the weapons have been transferred, and the weapons you have available to you at any given time are displayed at the bottom right of the screen. Weapons include machine guns, missiles, smoke screens and oil slicks, with the latter two being activated by a button on the joystick plugged into the secondary port. You can also use your car to destroy some enemy agents by ramming them off the road for points. I never really got on with this game in the arcade. I always found it too hard and really fiddly with the array of controls that you had to master. It helps then that the C64 version's got simplified controls compared to the arcade version. Gear changes are gone completely and you can use a second joystick to deploy oil or smoke. This was a pretty neat idea for the time, though I don't think there's any alternative if you didn't have a second joystick. You'd just not be able to deploy them, but they're not essential for the game, so it's not too much of a loss if you haven't got a second stick. And there's also the option for keyboard control as well. As well as the different control options, you've also got a choice of 2 difficulty levels, so this game's got pretty decent presentation. The graphics are quite simplistic and ugly, but they are from an early game, so we'll give it some leeway for that, and at least the scrolling's smooth. The sound effects are quite basic, with just shooting and explosion noises, and surprisingly there's no engine noise at all. The rendition of the classic Peter Gunn theme is pretty good though, so it's a shame it goes off as soon as you've been hit until another upgrade van shows up. Just like in the arcades, this is a pretty tough game, though it is mitigated a little by the unlimited lives while the timer's running down. Once that runs out though, you've got to be really careful, and it can be quite unfair at times as you get knocked off the road as soon as you start by enemies or neutral cars bumping into you as soon as you set off. The switchblade cars are particularly annoying, as sometimes they get you before you have a chance to react, such as when setting off or when you're moving fast and they appear on the screen in front of you. It's also really hard to knock the indestructible cars off the road without travelling at high speed. This version of the game sometimes seems a bit glitchy too, with cars appearing randomly or being blown up off screen. It's hard to maintain a high speed as it's difficult to react to forks in the road when you're pushed higher up the screen as you move faster. I feel the game could scroll faster without moving your vertical position, and I think this is a symptom of the game running in the horizontal orientation on the Commodore 64 as opposed to the vertical screen orientation of the arcade game. The game becomes more fun and generally a little bit easier when you get on the water, and the transition between the two environments is done well. If you make it far enough through the game, you'll have to face off against a helicopter, but if you haven't picked up the missiles from the weapons van, then you've got no chance of progressing from this point. When all said and done, this is a fair conversion of a game I'm just not that big a fan of. It hasn't aged particularly well, but I can see why it was highly praised at the time, and I did enjoy the C64 version more than the arcade. Next up we have another arcade conversion based on a Bally Midway coin-op from 1983, Tapper. This was released on the Commodore 64 in 1984. You play the role of the frenzied bartender trying to keep the never-ending flow of thirsty customers well watered. You'll have to keep slinging drinks, collecting your tips and occasionally guessing which cans of soda the soda bandit has shaken. In order to advance through each of the different bar scenes, you must successfully serve the customers as they approach you at each bar. When a customer finishes his drink, he'll sling his mug back to the bartender. You must catch the empty mug or lose a life. To pick up extra points, you may collect the tips customers will occasionally leave on the bar. When you grab the tip, a duo of dancing girls appears on the stage, but be careful, because when they do, the customers will naturally turn around to see them, and while their backs are turned, any mug you sling will end up on the floor. You mustn't allow customers to get all the way to the bartender's end of the bar without a drink. If you do, the disgruntled customer will sling the bartender down the bar. Every few rounds you'll participate in a bonus stage. The bartender waits at the side of the bar as a soda bandit appears, and he'll shake 5 of the 6 soda cans on the bar and shuffle them around. You have to keep a close eye on the one he has not shaken. When he's finished moving the cans around, move the bartender over to the can you think was not shaken by the bandit, and if you've chosen the unshaken soda can, you'll receive 3,000 bonus points. Things don't get off to a great start with this conversion as it's got no title screen and a very ugly text-based menu, but there are lots of options including number of players, difficulty levels and controls, and there's a basic demo mode as well. It's got the typically chunky graphics you expect from an early Commodore 64 game, but they are a good recreation of the arcade version. One nice detail is that you see a nice animation as the customer's drink levels go down. Sound-wise it's acceptable too, with the spot effects from the arcade game present and the familiar tunes giving a satisfying SID vibe. Of course what really matters is the gameplay, and that's very accurate, starting off silly but soon getting just as frantic as the arcade game, and just like that version it's really hard to get past level 4. All the expected gameplay elements and scoring techniques are present, but I did find a couple of niggles. I sometimes found the fire button a little slow to respond, getting stuck mid-pour, and the bartender seems slightly slower running down the bar to collect tips and glasses. Speaking of speed, the game slows down quite a bit when there's lots of customers on screen and speeds up when there's less. That perhaps suggests a little bit of inexperience from the programmer, and that's reinforced by the game being a little bit glitchy at times. When you get to the bonus stage it's painfully slow as the bandit takes ages to shake all the cans. I also noticed that this stage is Mountain Dew themed rather than either Budweiser or root beer, which were both seen in variants of the arcade game. Tapper's an arcade game that I've played a lot and I'm pretty fond of, and while this isn't a perfect conversion, it's a solid and playable offering for the time. Moving on, we have another arcade conversion. This is Up and Down, released in 1984. It's a conversion of a pretty obscure 1983 arcade game from Sega. You're racing your beach buggy, or Baja bugger as it's described in the instructions, over dangerous and treacherous roads, but your opponents aren't just trying to win the race, they're trying to make it the last race you run. The aim of the game is to navigate the course and collect a number of flags. Flags are collected simply by driving over them with your buggy, and they'll turn white when you pick them up. The coloured ones are the ones you still need to collect. The course has at least 2 lanes which zigzag across the screen and will intersect along the way. Some roads might lead to ramps which let you jump across stretches of broken road, and some roads lead to dead ends. If you jump and land off the road at any point, you'll lose one of your 5 cars. As your buggy travels down the treacherous roads, you'll encounter various opponents along the way. They may come from behind or may be moving in front of you at a slower or faster speed. You'll earn points for successfully jumping on top of them. When all 10 flags on a level have been collected, you'll advance to the next more difficult round. After you've completed a stage, a display will indicate the time it took to complete that course. If your elapsed time falls into one of the 5 bonus brackets, the applicable bonus will be added to your score. This is an odd little game that I've never played before on any format. It's another one with an ugly menu screen, but like Tapper it's got plenty of options including difficulty, number of players and controls. The graphics are typically chunky but quite cute and the scrolling's smooth. There's also a jolly tune that's short and repetitive and some appropriate sound effects. The first level's not too hard on easy mode, but the difficulty really ramps up on the second one as the cars move faster and it's really hard to get up the big hills without having to jump, which loses your speed. The downhill sections also make you go so fast that you can't avoid enemy cars if they suddenly appear, or often you'll try to jump over them and land in the scenery, losing a life. Compared to the arcade game that used a vertically orientated monitor, you've got a very small vertical screen area in this conversion, which makes it hard to react to enemies coming on screen. This problem is exacerbated by enemy cars appearing and disappearing randomly, not persisting when they go off the screen. The isometric perspective of the roads doesn't help either, as it makes the controls unintuitive. I ended up pushing the joystick in diagonals, which then engages the wrong direction on the stick, for example pushing left instead of up. Another problem is you can't jump in reverse, and it's also hard to change direction once you're moving, so you'll get hit by faster cars appearing and crashing into you. As you can probably guess, I found this really frustrating and didn't really enjoy it. It comes from an era where Sega tried several isometric 3D games that looked good but played poorly. Just as Congo Bongo released in the same period was a poor isometric variation of Donkey Kong, this is just an inferior isometric variation on the more well-known Rally X, and not nearly as much fun. That's the 3 arcade conversions out of the way then, so let's move on to the remaining 2 games in this compilation, and the next one I'm going to look at is Blue Max, and this was originally released in 1983. In this game you play the role of Flying Ace Max Chatworth, known as the Blue Max by his mates. You must make a final assault on 3 specially marked targets within the city, and you have only 1 aircraft and very little time to accomplish this most difficult of missions. When you start the game, your plane will appear on the runway and will automatically taxi along it. When your speed exceeds 100 miles an hour, you must pull on the joystick to take off. Your plane will lift off the runway and you may then proceed with your mission at your desired altitude. Your mission is to take out as many targets as possible. These include bridges, buildings, enemy planes, tanks, anti-aircraft batteries, vehicles and ships. From time to time some targets will be specially marked. These are primary targets and a certain number must be destroyed in order to proceed to the next stage. Air-to-ground strafing can be accomplished by reducing your altitude to below 25 feet and pressing the fire button. Left and right movement will improve strafing results. Bombing targets is accomplished by pressing the fire button and pushing towards the ground. You'll descend during a bombing run, so must be sure that your aircraft's high enough before you start. To complete a stage you must approach a friendly runway, descend and land. Repair work will begin automatically and you can watch progress on your command bar, or if you wish to abort you can press the fire button. Once you've repaired and refueled you must take off and get back into action. As with all takeoffs, your speed must reach 100 miles an hour before liftoff. The in-game control display gives lots of information including your altitude and speed, wind factor, remaining fuel and bombs. It also gives warnings about enemy planes and hazards and any information about damage you've sustained. Now Blue Max may not be an arcade game, but it certainly feels like one. It's effectively Zaxxon in a 20th century wartime setting, and it's no surprise that the developer of this game also programmed Zaxxon for the Commodore 64, as well as Panther, a pretty decent isometric shooter that was released by Mastertronic. The game's got a nice title screen for the era with some appropriate background music. There's plenty of options too, including difficulty levels, the choice of having gravity on or off, which makes your plane descend automatically if you switch it on, and there's also 2 control options, one of which more closely represents how you control a plane by allowing you to descend by pushing forward and climb by pushing backwards on the joystick. Once you get into the game you're treated to smooth scrolling and lots of variety in the landscape and enemies. I think it's got randomly generated landscapes, so no 2 games are exactly the same. Your main plane sprite and the enemy planes are well drawn and animated, though most other enemies are quite bland looking. There's no in-game music, but the sound effects are decent and appropriate with gunshots, bombs, explosions and your plane's engine noise. The status display at the bottom of the screen is packed with useful information, and there's lots of good on-screen indicators, such as the border colour changing when you reach strafing level or your altitude's low. So overall the presentation is great, though it has to be noted there's no high score recorded when you complete a game and no high score table either. Initially the game's very hard, even on the beginner level, until you get to grips with the controls. The isometric perspective is certainly clever for the time this game was released, but it can be hard to line up shots or judge how high you are. There's different ways to play the game. You can stay high and drop bombs on targets while you're out of range of the tanks, or go low and strafe the tanks, and you must adjust your strategy when your bombs or guns are damaged after being hit. After a bit of practice I did find it very satisfying to precision bomb small targets like cars and boats. The most difficult targets to hit are the enemy planes. You need to be at the same altitude as them, which is hard to judge, but they also move really quickly and don't stay on screen for long, so taking them out is more a matter of luck than judgment. When you complete a stage, the refueling and repair sequence on the runway gives a nice respite from the action, but it's also the cause of the biggest annoyances in the game. It's hard to get up to speed in time to take off on the shorter runways, especially if you didn't land on them soon enough, and planes flying towards you just as you take off can cause you to hit them or the ground because you can't ascend in time. I also noticed the occasional glitch when landing which causes you to crash on the runway, ending the game immediately. There's also a very fine line between the low altitude warning and just crashing into the ground, so you have to be careful. Shooting planes and then colliding with the wreckage is also a really annoying factor. You only get one life, so it's very unforgiving and can be hugely frustrating, but it's also really addictive as you find yourself saying one more go after you've crashed or been blown up. As you'll know if you follow this channel for a while, I'm not usually a fan of games using the isometric perspective, but this one is decent, though it still has some of the failings that perspective brings. It took me a while to get into, but in the end I really enjoyed it, and I can see why it's considered a classic of the early Commodore 64 era. Rounding out this compilation is another game originally released in 1983, Aztec Challenge. The player must guide the Aztec warrior through 7 different stages, and in each one deadly perils lurk for the hero. Before each stage begins, a scorecard will appear showing level and phase information as well as scores and brief instructions for the upcoming challenge. Each stage offers 5 attempts in which to complete the ordeal. If you use up all 5 lives without succeeding, then the scorecard returns and you have to try again. As long as you're unsuccessful, you stay at the same level. During most of the stages, the changing and building of the background music will indicate the extent of your progress, and you'll score points for individual achievements and receive bonus points for completing a challenge. If you're fortunate enough to complete all 7 levels, you'll be challenged by 3 additional phases. Here the action is increasingly more difficult, and in the final phase you must attempt to complete the challenge at night. Stage 1 is the gauntlet. You'll run towards the temple while Aztecs lined up on either side throw spears at your head and feet. Push up on the joystick to jump and down to duck. Staying in either mode for too long will cause you to fall, which constitutes the loss of a life. Any contact with a spear is a kill. This is the level that most people who've played the game remember most, and I have to say it's one of the most nerve-wracking experiences I've ever had in gaming. It should be simple, as all you've got to do is push up or down based on which spear appears, but you need to be laser focused on the screen to react quickly enough, and the further you get, the more tense it becomes, as you know one mistake and it's right back to the start. Stage 2 is the stairs. You're climbing the stairs up the face of the temple. From the top, stone blocks are rolled down at you, and all you do is dodge from side to side to avoid being flattened. I found this one pretty simple compared to the first stage. You just need to stay in the middle and dodge left or right as the blocks come down. The only problem I found is sometimes you'll get trapped when several blocks come down close together, so there is a little bit of luck involved. You can often squeeze between the blocks as they fall though. Stage 3 is the temple. To enter the temple itself you run through a long hallway protected by a complex security system. From the ceiling fall spears and stones, while spike traps spring up from the floor and trapdoors open before you. In this round your options are to push left on the joystick to stop running and push right to jump. This is the first stage where you really have some control over the action, and I did find a strategy for it. Try and stop as soon as you enter a new room so you can see what kind of hazards there are. If it's things falling from the ceiling, they come in cycles of 5 and there's a short delay before they restart, so you can time your run, though sometimes you'll still get hit by ones dropping in the doorway. If the hazards are the spike traps or holes, you can wait till they all appear before running across, and jumping them is actually quite simple. Stage 4 is the vermin. Deep inside the temple is a dark dungeonous place crawling with nasty creatures. Jump low by pushing down on the joystick and jump high by pushing up. If you touch any creature for more than a second, then its powerful venom will finish you off. This stage is very simplistic with just 2 types of jump, but the large jump can usually clear most creatures and has to be used for the big lizard. The collision detection isn't great in this one, so you can often land on them and not get killed, plus you get a split second to get away from them anyway. Many creatures drop randomly from the top of the screen, and in a lot of cases it's pointless as you've already run past them. You do occasionally need a bit of luck though, as sometimes a bunch of creatures will land together and you won't be able to clear them. Stage 5 is the tiles. The way out of the temple is a room covered with booby-trap tiles. You have 5 chances to find a safe way across the room by hopping to any tile you wish. Make it to the door on the other side and you've escaped the temple. This round's very obviously influenced by the opening scenes from Raiders of the Lost Ark. There's no skill involved at all, it's just trial and error until you find a safe route across. Any step on a booby-trapped tile will kill you and you've got no chance to react. Stage 6 is the Piranha. Swim across the lake that surrounds the Aztec city to reach the mountains on the other side. The water's infested with deadly man-eating fish. You can swim in any direction to avoid the fish, and you can dive under the water by pressing the fire button where you'll be safe. However, you can only stay underwater for 2 to 3 seconds or you'll drown. You must continue to make forward progress up the screen to complete the course. It took me a while to work out how you do this one. Eventually I worked out that you have to stay near the top and keep the music progressing to complete. I found it easiest to stay roughly central near the top and only use the dive when you really have to, as you can only stay submerged for a couple of seconds. It's quite a boring level because it just gets tedious trying to survive. And I must also add that I think it'd be near impossible to see the fish if you're colourblind or were playing on a black and white TV back in the day. The final stage is the bridge. Freedom's in sight, but it's across an immense gorge in the mountains traversed by a flimsy bridge with holes in it. You can do a short jump by pushing down on the joystick, a medium jump by pushing left, and push up for the longest jump. Just like stage 1, this is another endurance and reaction test, as you need to push the joystick in the right direction to make a short, medium or long jump, depending on whether the gaps are 1, 2 or 3 blocks wide. You need to try and jump right at the very edge of a gap to give the best chance of clearing them, and also to see how long the gap is before you jump. Sometimes you can get lucky by doing a longer jump over a smaller hole and getting some solid sections for a few blocks after. So those are my tips for the individual stages, and now let's have some general observations. The game's overall presentation is good with an arcade style of track mode that has a demo of each stage, and it's good that between levels you get an explanation of how to play them, including the controls. This is important since the controls differ from one stage to the next. The graphics vary massively from stage to stage. Some levels look great for the time, such as the first one, but others are really bad, such as the glitchy scrolling on stage 2 and the lack of effort on the background and the primitive sprites of stage 4. I also found that the main character graphic is quite glitchy on levels 3 and 4. The music's good and I like the way it builds up tension as it progresses, but it started to get boring after playing through many levels over and over again. The sound effects are simple but functional and can be used as cues for action on certain stages. The game is very hard and it needs fast reactions, perseverance and sometimes a bit of luck to progress. The controls are very responsive though, which is vital given what you've got to do in each level. I found this a strange game overall. There's not really any aim other than survival. There's minimal interaction from one stage to the next, and it's almost like a laserdisc arcade game or interactive movie like Dragon's Lair. You're not really controlling the action, the game is just kind of going on around you and you just have to try and keep up. You do score points, but you can't really play for a high score since the game can go on forever, and the worse you are, the more attempts you need and the more points you'll end up with if you do finish the game. It's got a weird scoring system where you get more bonus points for completing a stage on your first life than your fifth, but because a stage restarts after 5 attempts, that means you can get more points on your 6th attempt than your 5th. If you do manage to complete a wave of 7 stages, you're not even rewarded with a completion screen, it just jumps back to the start but more difficult, most notably on level 1 where the spears are closer together and faster as phases progress, so it's harder to tell whether to jump or duck. I feel the game would have been more replayable if it had a time limit to complete all 7 stages in a phase, or a maximum number of attempts for each stage. As it is, it just becomes a chore to play, and because there's no real game over, not much incentive to play again once you've seen all the stages. I've shared my thoughts on the 5 games then, so let's now round things up with some ratings for the games and the compilation as a whole. Starting with Spy Hunter, it's not one of my favourite games but was a decent conversion at the time, which does benefit from the simplified controls compared to the other versions I've played. I'm going to give it 7 out of 10. Tapper was slow at times with the occasional glitch, but none of that stops it being a fun and authentic recreation of the arcade game. I'm also giving it 7 out of 10, but the truth is that Tapper's better than Spy Hunter, and I'd actually give Tapper 7.5 and Spy Hunter 6.5, but I'm not messing around with half marks, so the two 7s are just averaging those out. Up and Down seems to be a fairly accurate conversion of an obscure arcade game that probably wasn't very good in the first place, and I found it very difficult and annoying after the first stage. I'm giving it 5 out of 10. Blue Max has some of the failings that befall many isometric games and can sometimes be unfair, but it's a polished and playable shooter that's highly addictive and worthy of 7 out of 10. And finally, Aztec Challenge is an ambitious game for the time with some admirable moments, but it's let down by an infuriating difficulty level and random elements that are out of your control. Having unlimited lives in this one isn't really a plus point, as that seriously impacts replayability and makes it very un-arcadey. I'm giving it 6 out of 10. So moving on to the overall compilation rating, and firstly the packaging, well, I didn't think it was particularly good. The front cover artwork is misleading in terms of what games it's representing, and there's not much information about those games on the back of the packaging either. The instructions are comprehensive but have also got some weird aspects to them, so with all that in mind I'm going to give the packaging a score of 6. The score for the games averages out at 6.4, and in terms of value for money, well, it's 5 games for 10 quid, so 2 quid a game, and none of the games are absolutely terrible, though I wasn't really a fan of Up and Down. So overall, considering when this was released, I think it was very good value for money. I'm going to give it a score of 8. That means that the overall compilation rating for Arcade Hall of Fame comes out at 66%. It's a strangely named compilation given that not all the games are arcade conversions, but it offered a pretty solid and varied selection of titles at the time of release, though some look and play quite dated by the standards of later C64 games. It was definitely good value for money when it came out in 1985, given that there were very few compilations at that point, and it would have been an excellent accompaniment to your brand new C64 if you got one for Christmas that year. Couldn't find any magazine reviews for this compilation, but I did find a preview of it from the December 1985 issue of Zap 64. They give each game in the compilation a short write-up, so I think it's worth a look even though it's not a proper review. So as you can see from the article entitled US Gold Gets It Together, it confirms that this was their first ever compilation tape and says it contains 5 very popular games, although some of them are getting on a bit, which is basically what I've just said. It says the package represents good value for money, and the games are Spy Hunter, a pretty smart shoot 'em up and a Zap Sizzler, Tapper, fast frantic fun slinging sodas to very thirsty and impatient customers, Up and Down, a vertical scrolling dodge 'em game, it doesn't really give much of a write up for that one, Blue Max is sort of a Zaxxon in a biplane, and Aztec challenges 7 screens of Aztec action. So it doesn't really say much about the games, good or bad, but it goes on to say separately the 5 games retail at well over 40 quid, but you can buy them together for only £9.95 on cassette and £12.95 on disc, which does actually differ from what the advert says. So it says you can't say fairer than that now, can you, John? Well, I agree. At the time, 10 quid for those 5 games was definitely good value. So to round things off, as I always do, let's take a look at where Arcade Hall of Fame falls into my compilation Hall of Fame, and as you can see, it's gone in at 2nd place, below We Are the Champions and above Quattro Firepower with 66%. That brings another edition of the Commodore 64 Compilation Comparison to an end. If you've got any thoughts about this compilation and the games that are included in it, then please let me know in the video comments, and I'll be back with another compilation review in the near future. Between now and then, there'll be other retro gaming content on my channel, so stay tuned for that. Thanks very much for watching this video, and until the next one, bye for now.